Hey, and welcome back. I spend a lot of time hunting around sites like Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist for good deals on used drums, mostly to do projects on this channel. One of the places that I keep an eye on and is really good in my local market is the Goodwill auction site. Now, you can filter this by your location to one of these Goodwill headquarters for your region, and oftentimes you can find killer vintage drums that you can bid on and even have shipped out to you wherever you live. I like to keep an eye on the ones that are local pickup only because that makes me only competing with my local market as opposed to anybody everywhere. Every once in a while I see acrylites, vintage Slingerland drums, but it's mostly a bunch of beginner, forgotten drum equipment that people want to donate and just get out of their attic. While I was scrolling on there about a month ago, I saw a listing for just a cheap generic snare drum for $12.99. And I figured, why not just throw down the minimum bid of $12.99 and see if I win? And I did. So I drove up to Appleton, which is about 30 minutes from me, and picked this drum up and brought it home. And as you can see, I have it now. From first glance, it's a CB700 drum, which is actually the first kit I ever had. It was a CB Drums green 5-piece drum set. I don't think it was the same era as this. This looks a bit older, maybe from the 80s, but I'm really not sure. I thought it would be fun to try to fix this up, mostly with parts I had on hand and just giving it a good cleaning, and see how good I could make this $13 snare drum sound. And my original hope was to set it up before and give you a demo of it, but it's pretty much unplayable right now. The snare wires are falling off. It was held on by a rubber band and some string, not even like proper snare cord, but just general string. And aside from that, the bottom head seems pretty much toast. And the top head is just one of those white heads, but it's not actually like coated with texture. It's just the mylar material that's not translucent or transparent like a normal drum head would be. I don't know why those existed, but if one of you does, leave it in the comments. I'm gonna bring this over to the workbench, take it apart, clean it, maybe pack the lugs, and then we're gonna bring it over to the studio and see how good of a job I could do with what I had on hand here today. So let's get into it. So like almost all of my other drum projects, this started out by stripping this drum down to the shell. This began with removing the snare wires, and for some reason, the screws used on the throw-off were flatheads, while the screws used on the butt plate were Phillips. This makes no sense to me, but probably just in line with this drum being cheap and using whatever parts were easy to mass produce. I used a drill with a drum key bit attachment to remove all the tension rods, and this made quick work of getting the hoops and heads off of both sides of this drum. As I tapped on the raw shell, I heard a lot of noise, and not in the way you'd appreciate from a metal shell. So this was my cue to remove the lugs and pack them with cotton balls to try and keep the springs inside from adding any extra noise. Of course, a step like this takes a lot of time because even with an electric drill, I still needed to remove 40 lug screws and then individually pack cotton ball fragments into each lug and then reattach by hand. I guess it could have been possible to use a drill for screwing the lugs back on, but I always worry about stripping threads with something like this, so I typically opt to do it by hand. About halfway through the process of removing and reattaching lugs, I realized that I completely forgot to clean the shell, so even though you're seeing me do this step now, I'd highly recommend doing it while most of the hardware is removed from the shell. For this process, I like to use a mixture of dish soap and water, and this works great for getting off light grime and gunk. After wiping down the entire surface area, I then came back with some steel wool to try to remove any more stubborn buildup on the shell. At this point, I also made a decision to remove this small ID badge, which I see on a lot of drums that are either in schools or rental programs, so I'm assuming that may offer some insight to where this drum originally came from. To get rid of the adhesive from this badge, I used a product called Goof Off. This works great for a lot of things in my drum restoration projects, so I recommend keeping some on hand if you don't already have it. After doing one final pass on the shell with a microfiber cloth, I moved on to the hoops, which were probably the dirtiest part of this drum. Again, I used the steel wool to remove the light rust and crud buildup, and honestly, just spending a few minutes doing this goes a long way on hoops. Next up, it was time to start putting this drum back together and begin reheading. For the batter side, I pulled out this Remo controlled sound coated head, which I bought a while back and didn't end up liking on the drum I was working on at the time. It has barely any wear on it, so I'm hopeful that it'll work well on this drum. I made sure to add some white lithium grease to the tension rods as I went through the process of threading them back into the lugs, and the main goal here is to try and avoid any future friction between the rod and the threaded insert over time, which could lead to stripping. Moving on to the resonance side, I used a head that I bought from Drum Factory Direct. DFD has a great reputation for affordable prices and offering a variety of drum parts, but I don't think many people know about their in-house drum heads they sell, which come in much cheaper than your everyday brands. Lately, when I've been putting in orders for small batches of parts for various projects, I've been adding a few of their generic heads on the order to help get me past the threshold for free shipping. It's come in handy to have these heads on hand, ready to grab and use whenever I get the motivation to work on a drum, and it helps me keep the cost down overall. As I got down to the last few tension rods on this side, I realized that one of them was a bit longer than the others, so I went to my back storage room and swapped it out for another shorter one I had in my stock. The snare wires I originally ripped off this drum were way too far gone to reuse, but I always have a few sets in my back room, but in any case, it's a pretty standard 16 strand wire and it'll work fine on this drum. I planned on using some ribbon to attach these wires to the throw-off, but as I unwound the end of my roll, I discovered I wouldn't have enough left. I then went back and grabbed a set of plastic straps, only to find out they were too wide for the butt plate, which led me to settle on using this nylon cord. So after only 30 minutes, this drum was back in playing order, and I could take it into my studio to test out and record some demos. First impression is really not too great, but I gotta be honest, I am not a wizard at medium or low tunings, and it's not something I particularly enjoy for my live playing. It's something I kind of do out of necessity for tracking mostly when it fits the song. But when I do lower tunings, I usually try to use muffling to help support my lack of expertise in this range. So I'm gonna throw a snare weight on here, and then let's try this again. So that's a little bit better. I would definitely say this is a workable sound. And if this were a drum left at a church or a venue where I just had to come in and play on it, I could get by on it. It wouldn't bother me too much, but it's not something I'm excited about. I do think that this drum head is playing a bigger factor than the one I usually use, which is just a single ply coated head. This controlled sound coated head has that large ring in the middle, and it really does affect the feeling to where buzzing on it or getting nuanced rebound is a little more challenging. But then it also just kills so much of the character of the shell, which I think in this case is probably a good thing. Let's tune it up a little bit and see what it's like at a more high tuning. It's still not ideal, but I like kind of the nasty ring and bark to this drum. It's not a universal sound that I want all the time, but it would definitely be something I would grab off the shelf and use in a specific circumstance, maybe in like more of an industrial style track. I'm going to go ahead and throw the muffling on here, even though if I was going to use it at this tuning, I think I would like the sustain, but just to give you a more comprehensive image of this sound. Again, this is not how I would prefer this drum to be muffled in this tuning range, but it doesn't sound bad. I think between the center dot on the head and the snare weight on top, it's too much muffling. And I don't even have the internal muffler on at all, so that's not playing a factor, and that's another option you could include. Before I call this demo a wrap, I want to do one more test with this, and that's do something with cross stick, just to see how that responds between the triple flange tube and the shell altogether. The cross stick actually sounds pretty nice on here. I don't know if that's getting some extra contribution from the shell, because usually I like a die-cast hoop for a nice thick cross stick groove, but this triple flange hoop sounds pretty good, and that's something I would also enjoy if I were using this drum in that sort of circumstance. Overall, I do think there are plenty of flaws with this drum. When I hit the shell after I put it back together, it still had a bit of that kind of springy rattle noise. Maybe I could have packed more cotton balls into each lug, but I've done that on a number of drums, and usually one or two right around the spring does the job. The snare throw-off is definitely another flaw on this drum. It does work fine, and it goes on and off pretty smoothly, but when I turn it off, I'm getting a little bit of snare buzz still, touching the drum, and I don't even have the snare wires that tight. I'm gonna blame that more on the throw rather than on me with my tuning and dialing in the tension on it. Now, at the end of the day, is this drum worth the $13 I paid for it and the half hour of time I put into fixing it up? I think so. It's nothing special, but it could be a nice piece to your collection if you're looking to kind of expand your offerings. I could see this ending up at like one of my friends' studios where they're not a drummer, but they want to have a few different snares on hand to choose from for different sessions, because it doesn't sound that bad for the small amount of things it does well. When it comes to a really nice drum, I think the variety of things it can do is really the benefit, right? Some of my most prized drums, like my Superphonic, I can do really low, I can do really high, I could do really ringy, I can do really tight and controlled. This kind of is a one-trick or two-trick pony. I'd love to hear what you think about this video in the comments, and if any of you out there own a drum similar to this, where it's just kind of a beater drum that you have in your collection next to plenty of nicer drums, so leave a comment down below and let me know. And until next time, thanks.